Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. So they were crop dusters and debutantes, college girls and performers in flying circuses, but all were qualified and trained pilots. Becky Aikman joins me to tell the story of the Spitfires, the American women who flew in the face of danger, based on her book, which there are links, as always, in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore, depending on where you are in the world. But I'll bring Becky in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Paul.
It's great for you to be here. So the women in World War II and flying and things like that, we're in an era where we are talking about this a lot more than we were 20 or 30 years ago. And the gatekeepers have kind of backed off a little bit and allowing people to talk about the women. And this is, as we'll get into, this isn't something that was just a little bonus, frivolous PR thing that they were doing. This was a very, very serious, important part of getting aircraft to places. So before we get into the women themselves, in looking at your website and looking at what you've done before, you seem to be particularly drawn to kind of mavericks and trailblazers and strong and feisty and independent minded. And you have all those qualities with these American women back in World War II. So, you know, why were you inspired to write about this group of people?
It actually started when I was seeking out a new subject for a book, and I was speaking to my mother and told her that I would like to write something about people who did something incredible, but no one's heard of them. And she immediately said, "You should write about the American women who flew in England in World War II." This was something I'd never heard of. When I started looking into it, I couldn't find anything about it at first. These women had been completely forgotten, even though they played a really important role in the war and in aviation history. After the war, their story was just sort of lost. So I decided, yes, this is the story for me. And you're right. These were trailblazing, tough, independent, really fascinating women from all different backgrounds, all different personalities. And it made for a great story.
And that's, you know, we were just saying before going live there, unlike some of the new things that were developed in World War II, from units, from special forces to gadgets, some of them, they meet a lot of resistance kind of right at the beginning, and they have to fight and fight and fight to get through. And I'm thinking of things like the Tuskegee Airmen. But in actual fact, there was a reasonably smooth transition. There was obviously a manpower crisis, even from the very kind of early months of World War II, especially from the American and British and Canadian points of view. So clearly, finding a solution to the manpower shortage, of course, was there and kind of pushed it. So it did. I mean, not a smooth history or so, but there were bumps along the way. But it didn't. It was something that was wanted, particularly in Britain, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, there was one big bump. These were all qualified pilots who were women in the United States, and the U.S. military would not accept women to fly. So they thought they were out of luck. They wouldn't have a chance to serve in the war. But then they did hear that Great Britain was desperate enough that they formed this unit for transporting aircraft, and they would accept people from other countries. They would accept people who had disabilities that might disqualify them from the RAF, and they would accept women. So these 25 women very boldly went up to Canada, passed flight tests, got on cargo ships that took them across the Atlantic when German submarines were prowling all around, so that they would have the chance to fly. And they really got their chance. They had the adventure they dreamed of.
I mean, and yeah, some of the statistics about the numbers of millions of miles they collectively flew, and every type of aircraft, and you know, all across the war zones and what have you. So incredibly important. But there are, amongst these trailblazers and pioneers, there are people who are incredibly important, at the top of the top, because the individual pilots themselves were incredibly important, but there were some ambassadors behind this. So give us a couple of the people who were instrumental into getting these American women in, and not just the women themselves. There were male ambassadors. I'm thinking of people like Hap Arnold and people like that who were, you know, were not averse to this idea. So who are some of the kind of the pioneers in getting this, and I'm going to use the pun intended, getting it off the ground?
Well, the one person most responsible for getting it off the ground was the famous American aviator, Jacqueline Cochran. She was a self-made millionaire from her cosmetics company. She had won many important cross-country races. She set many speed and altitude records. She was very renowned in the United States and elsewhere in the world at the time as the leading woman aviator. She spoke to General Hap Arnold in the United States about trying to form a unit where women pilots could fly within the United States. And she didn't make enough headway early on before the US entered the war. She also lobbied Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband, the president. Jackie worked really hard at this, but when it looked like she was not going to succeed, she decided she would take a small group of American women to Great Britain to join the Air Transport Auxiliary there. And if they performed well, she would use that example to try to convince the United States to form their own women's flying unit, which they ultimately did based on what she achieved in England when they formed the WASP.
Yeah. And this is the thing about, I mean, Britain absolutely just had to use women from the earliest days of World War II because there were so many jobs, so many tasks. So in the factories, in the driving the buses, and so Britain in that regard was kind of paving the way. And it's interesting when it comes up on this channel that Germany, despite its problems in 43, 44, never resorted to using women in any real capacity at all in its military, except in very small numbers. It didn't mobilize. But Britain did, and it's interesting that Jackie is seeing that British solution and then molding it and taking it into the American ideal. And it came up in the sidebar about the fact that the people who were flying in the 1930s, and some of these women had been flying since really the early days of aviation, you had to have a bit of money. It kind of, so that, although in my introduction there, we're saying they are from quite a broad cross section. To get into flying, you have to have some kind of backing financially to get it. So explain sort of what sort of women were getting into flying in the USA in the 1930s.
Well, I think it was a little different in the USA and in England, where it was mostly aristocratic and well-to-do women who were flying. And they were a little shocked at the boisterous behavior of the Americans when they arrived, because they were not all from the most upper crust backgrounds. Some of them were. One of them was a member of the family of the Western Union fortune, and she was expected to grow up and be a debutante and capture a wealthy husband. This was something that didn't interest her at all. Her name was Virginia Farr. So she saw this escape to Great Britain as a wonderful escape from those expectations of her family. But some of them were not well off at all. One of them, Mary Webb Nicholson, wanted to learn to fly, and she bartered for flying lessons by agreeing to jump out of an aircraft 3 times in an air show with a parachute. There she is there, without any training. And back then, they didn't wear the parachute on their back. She would creep out onto the wing, and someone would creep out behind her holding this big puff of fabric, and Mary would jump and the other person would let it go, and she floated down, and as a result, she got her lessons. Another one was Roberta Sandaz. She was a crop duster, and she wanted to have more flying lessons. So she agreed to appear in an air show doing a fake striptease, where she would fly over the field multiple times, and each time she would toss an item of clothing out of the aircraft until theoretically it was all gone. She would land it. Of course, the whole thing had been fake. She was fully dressed. Another one was named Dorothy Fury. She came from quite an impoverished background in New Orleans, but she was a great beauty. She only had an 8th grade education, but she had worked since she was 14 and had a Model T car. She traded that in for flying lessons. So it was a real mix of people, and a few of the younger ones got free flying lessons from the civilian pilot training program that was started before the war so that there would be more pilots. And many of the classes held 1 spot for a woman. And some of my people got that 1 spot and learned to fly that way. So it was a real mix. And most of them wanted to fly to earn a living. They weren't doing it for fun. They wanted jobs as flying instructors. They wanted to be in the military. They wanted to be pilots for passenger aircraft. So they were not the upper class that some of the British officials were expecting to arrive on their shores.
And it's that interesting thing that when we talk about that era of flying, there is that passion. It's that genuine wonder for getting in the air now. Yeah. And it is just a couple of decades really after flight began at all. And so when you read about the air races, be they German, be they Australian, there's always that sort of childhood looking up at the sky, wanting to be there. And you see those exact same qualities in the women you write about. There's this sense of adventure. But as you say there, it has to be a paid job as well. They want to make their own way, and flying is a means of making their own way in a profession where, in a sense, there weren't really rules, because I suppose in some areas of business there had been rules for decades and decades about women can't do that, but flying was, I guess, so new that they're kind of getting into it before there'd almost been a hierarchy of well, what do you mean you want to do this? There hadn't been the kind of protocol, so it was kind of a new thing to get involved in that everybody was new to it, I suppose.
Yes. And also there were a lot of famous women aviators at the time.
Yeah.
And others who performed in air shows, who won races. They got a lot of press coverage. It was portrayed as being very glamorous. So this attracted a lot of people for that reason. But most of them, they just loved to fly. They felt euphoric in the sky. They felt that sense of freedom, that sense that they were the ones in control. They absolutely loved it, and they were determined to try to keep doing it for the rest of their lives, which was why serving in the war was an important step toward establishing that they had the bona fides to be great pilots.
So the serving in the war aspect, let's pick up that, because I think when people look on the internet about what these pilots did, there's a blurring of the lines between combat and non-combat, because if they haven't got machine guns, or if they're not being attacked by fighter, it's not really combat. And I'm intrigued by the fact they are obviously in inherent danger, and yet they're in this category that's sort of halfway between. It's not in full combat, but it's not without its dangers. So how do you kind of rectify that when you explain to people what these pilots did? Because to say they're just delivery drivers, which I've heard kind of negative things like that's really dismissive and pathetic. But then also saying they were kind of combat pilot, that doesn't seem kind of right either. So how would you describe to a lay person exactly what they're doing?
Their job was to transport aircraft from the factories to the airfields, and then they would transport damaged aircraft from the airfields back to maintenance units to be repaired. It was actually a very dangerous job. 1 in 7 pilots who performed this job during the war were killed in crashes, and there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, one of the most important aspects of the war at that time was to build up a huge force of aircraft, because no one was prepared for the number of aircraft they would need. So the factories were churning them out so fast. They weren't particularly well tested. Pilots often took off in these brand new aircraft, and the engine would fail. There would be a gas leak. The propeller fell off one aircraft that one of the American women was flying. Many things happened that led to disastrous crashes, or led the pilots to have to make spectacular saves to save themselves and the aircraft they were flying. So that was very dangerous. Obviously, flying aircraft back from battles, doors were blown off, parts were damaged, things were held together with tape. They didn't really know till they were high in the sky that they were in an aircraft that might not make it. They often had to land on farmers' fields somewhere to get back down on the ground. And finally, there was the issue of the British weather, which was very changeable. There were often cloudy, stormy conditions, and these pilots flew without instruments. Often they hadn't been installed yet until they were taken to maintenance units, but they were just forbidden to use them, because the theory was they didn't want to have to teach the pilots. They didn't want the pilots taking off if conditions weren't ideal. But the fact is, many people got caught in real disasters when they flew into clouds and smacked into mountains, or lost the lift of the aircraft and crashed that way. So it was a very dangerous job and a very important job. They weren't shooting or being shot at, but they knew that any flight could be their last.
We had a fantastic question from Trevor Sheehan, who I saw at the weekend in the conference in London. Trevor is saying, what was their legal status? How are they aligned with the Geneva Convention requirements? So if, for example, an aircraft got, really, really badly off course and it crashed in occupied France or something like that, what was their status? Simple question. A simple question. Maybe it's a complicated answer.
I don't think it particularly came up. I never heard about it being an issue with any of the people I wrote about. They were non-combatants for sure, but they were serving in the war. Sometimes they would be shot at in the sky with German aircraft going overhead, and they were told to do just try to escape, not to do anything to fight back, even if they were in an aircraft that was armed. So I wouldn't say that was one of the big issues that they faced doing this job. Almost all of the missions were taking aircraft between points within the United Kingdom because most of the air bases were there. So not a lot of air transport pilots wound up over enemy territory.
It's just an interesting question there. The next thing is looking at, for example, their diaries and their flight logs. I mean, they were leaping in and out of so many different aircraft and different airfields and different conditions and different, and as you said, often on their own. It's that when you look at some of the, I don't know, the 8th Air Force, for example, and you're a new bomber crew and you go up on your first mission there is a lot of people around you. There's a lot of people. You're following other people down that same runway. You're getting into formation, and then over the next few days and weeks, if you survive, you can get better and better at that particular aircraft and start to learn its weaknesses and its positive. These women are not, they don't really have that benefit. I mean, they might get a run of delivering a particular type of aircraft, but they have to be masters of so many different types of flying, so many different and as you say, the fact that they're bringing back damaged aircraft. I mean, they had to clearly be excellent flyers. As I said at the top of the show, they weren't there to make up numbers. They were there because they were solidly good flyers, and that comes across in reading your book. And do you think the ones that ended up there, the ones you chose about, was that flying ability natural? Do you think it came because you read about these? Oh, he was a natural flyer. She was a natural. I never quite know as a non-flyer what that means, but do you think they were?
I think those who made it through to the end had to be. They would be required to fly up to 147 different models of aircraft. And they were trained on one example in each of several classes. One was very small, light, single engine aircraft. The next step up was the fighters. They were single engine, but they were fast, they were powerful, they were exciting. The women loved to fly those. Then they would move up to bombers, 2-engine bombers, and ultimately there would be 4-engine bombers. Not all the women made that grade by the end of the war. So it was a tremendous variety, and I agree with you. I was stunned by how different this job was from someone in the Air Force who was performing one kind of mission over and over again. They had to be very flexible, and they had to have some kind of natural ability because they didn't have the time to learn and do it the more methodical way. They would often get into an aircraft they had never seen before. They had a little booklet called Ferry Pilot's Notes that fit in a pocket. It had one page on each aircraft. They'd see what the parameters were, what the speed should be, all those kinds of details, and they'd have a few minutes and they'd take off. So yes, they had to have that flexibility that only a natural flyer can have. They obviously were trained on one of each, but they had to be pretty daring about taking the knowledge they had and putting it to use in all different situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing, before we get into some of the incredible women you write about, there are quite a lot of photos of these women, and because it obviously was something novel, so the press were interested to some extent, and Britain particularly, we go back to where I'm from, there was always in the pictorials, there's pictures of the women driving the buses and women in the factory, because it was newsworthy and it was encouraging other women to get involved and offer their services there. So there was a lot of press attention, but I'm assuming they did encounter certain elements of sort of sexism. I know there's discussions about what they should wear and should it be this and should it be that, and how should their hair be up or down. Do those kind of conversations they're obviously distracting from the real skills they were doing, but I guess it was that kind of necessary evil of the way the press at the time would have been interested in the fact that they're young, good-looking young ladies. So when you're reading the articles and things that were created in the war, do you have to kind of read between the lines in rather kind of the sexist is a strong word, but the way they were written about at the time?
They were always described in terms of what they looked like.
Yeah.
The petite blonde, that sort of thing. It always was in there. They were used to that from the United States, because before they went over, they were a novelty there as well.
Yeah.
If they were in an air show, one of them was the youngest woman flying instructor in the United States. She was frequently photographed because she was very pretty. And they loved to have them standing on airplanes, and posing. So there was always that element. There was a certain amount of attention to their gender on the job. Famously, there was a controversy about whether they should be wearing pants or skirts. And finally, the women won that battle, saying, really, it's decent climbing up the wing of an aircraft in a skirt. But there was one officer's mess at one of the airfields that had a sign outside that said, "Women must remove trousers before entering the mess." Not fully understanding how that sounded. They never changed into the dress uniform with the skirt. But so they encountered a certain amount of that. But I have to say, the women I wrote about never thought about this stuff. They were so eager to fly. They loved to fly. They wanted to fly. They were also pretty tough ladies. So they would brush things off when they happened and never took them seriously. When I would read their diaries and letters, they never complained about that stuff. It was not that important. And frankly, during the war, people appreciated what they did and treated them quite equally, as you may know.
Yeah.
It was one of the first, I think it was the first equal pay law ever passed by Parliament. And it was so the air transport pilots would be paid the same as men. And that was because there was proof they were doing the exact same job. People appreciated it. So they weren't discriminated against too much. I saw it as sort of a women's utopia there for a while. They were needed so much. They had a skill that was so valued that they didn't have a lot of trouble dealing with people who didn't like women doing things.
And I guess they were living in that world anyway. If they'd got to the point where they were flying, they knew how to, play the game and get on with it, and just, a time to kind of play the pretty card, and then the next time play the technical card. And we could go down a rabbit hole of how it is for women in military history. It's the same kind of deal to 2025, that you know what the game is, what people are going to be judging about, and these women were pioneers for that in that field, as well as flying, just how to behave in a world that has been associated with one sex, and then adapting it to let you become part of that world. So I guess they were masters of that as well as flying. So let's get back to some of the women, because you selected a particular 9 of these 25, and as we said there, they come from all different backgrounds. You did want to particularly bring in some new research, so you wanted to just get some new diaries, new information. So how did you narrow it down to the ones? Let's maybe go through your favorite ones and one at a time, and we'll discuss that process of selecting these, because as I said, you have so many to choose from.
It's true, although some left better diaries and letters behind than others. So that automatically excluded those where I couldn't find a whole lot of information. I needed to exclude them anyway, because I couldn't confuse readers with too many characters. I wound up with more characters than I ideally might have wanted, but they were all such great personalities and so different. And I feel that readers can keep them straight because they are so different. So I kept saying, I'll include her too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we see there's some of the photos, and they all, it's just a really ridiculous comment to say, but when you sent me the photos, they all have such amazing faces. They all just have something about them that you knew that you could trust these women to do this job. They look tough is oversimplifying it. They just had a resolve about them, a determination, a grit, because they are serving their country, but they're not probably doing what they would. If you'd asked, they probably really would have liked to be flying, you know, fighter bombers into Germany and doing that. They're not allowed to do that, so they're having to do a really important, but not probably what they want to do. But they've got that something in common in their faces. So let's talk about Anne.
They all had a certain amount of swagger.
Yeah.
They knew they were good at what they were doing, and that gave them a lot of confidence. Anne Wood was a very good example. She was, I believe, 22, 23 when she went over. She was a college graduate. She had been president of her college class, and she had wonderful, smooth social graces. People in England thought she was a Philadelphia socialite because she had a Philadelphia accent. She sounded sort of like Katharine Hepburn. And she had these social graces that made people think that she had operated at the height of society all her life. In fact, she was from Waldoboro, Maine. Her family consisted of her widowed mother and 3 siblings, and Anne always knew she would have to work as an adult to support them. So while she came across that way, she used that skill to try to advance her career. She spent a lot of her time while in England going to London. She would hobnob with diplomats and journalists and generals and spies, people of position who she thought after the war could help her get a substantial position in government or business or aviation. So she was very smooth and also a very good pilot. So she was well respected by everyone.
No, I mean that they all see this as not just a war surf. They see it as a stepping stone in a career. It's an important thing to be part of and defeat the Axis, but it's a personal thing. It's about they really are ambitious, you know. Whereas sometimes, you know, we deal with male veterans who are serving their country, but as soon as they get a chance to get out of the army, they want to go back home and do whatever it was they were doing before the war. These women, it's a career opportunity. It's I will do this and then I will do more than that. And that's something that I really took away from your book, is that the war is just the start, isn't it, really?
They were adventurous people. They wanted to have exciting, original lives. This was a highlight for them. They were doing something so important, so dramatic, so glamorous and dangerous. They loved it, and they wanted to keep moving on to other exciting, adventurous things after the war, and they did see it as a stepping stone.
Well, here's another woman who had, you know, there's another extraordinary life, an extraordinary career. So tell us about this amazing, and again, striking faces.
Yes. Well, I mentioned her before. This is Dorothy.
Yeah.
She's the one with the 8th grade education and the impoverished background in New Orleans. She saw this as an opportunity to reinvent herself and become the person she wanted to be. She was quite intelligent and self-educated, and she also had a very imperious way about her. So when she arrived in England, people assumed she was some sort of American aristocrat.
Yeah.
She didn't dissuade anybody. She had one red dress that she recycled for every event she was invited to. And she was a striking beauty. The gentleman in the photograph there with her is Lord Beatty. He was a millionaire British lord. He spotted her in the bar in a hotel in Southampton near where she was based. He wanted desperately to meet her, so much that he gave a ball and invited everyone at the airbase to the ball so that he would have a chance to be introduced to her. She had quite the effect on men, and this was definitely a stepping stone for her, being in England, meeting these people, having people assume she was from this background. She entered a completely different life.
You know, amazing. And the newspaper article was about the kind of the Southern belle aspect, and she does a kind of a Wallace Simpson in a way. But although I'm not a fan of Wallace Simpson as a human being, she seems much nicer. But she did that. She just elbows her way into British high society through sheer force of character, force of personality, and a little bit of white lying along the way, a bit of allowing them to think something about her that isn't really true, but who the hell cares? She's just dominating her way and getting what she wants. And it's just, yeah, that's the thing that unites these women from my point of view, reading about it. So we'll carry on and talk about some of the others, because I said they're all amazing. We've done Anne, so let's Hazel Raines.
Hazel Raines was another interesting character. She came from a middle-class background in Georgia. She called her family a hat and gloves, church-going kind of family. She studied music in college. She was expected to have a very genteel life, but she got the flying bug and wound up joining the Georgia Air Races and Show as a stunt pilot who performed loop-de-loops and spins where she would spin toward the ground and save herself at the last moment while audiences screamed in terror. She was a soft-spoken person, but a big personality in the air. I often said she was awkward on the ground and graceful in the sky. She wanted to be a military pilot desperately. There was one headline that I put in the book. It says, Georgia Miss wants to be bomber pilot despite male Snickers. But she was very happy to join the Air Transport Auxiliary, and her stunt flying skills came in very, very handy. She was in a terrible accident at one point in a Spitfire where it was a new Spitfire. The engine failed right as she entered a cloud and was doing a turn. So she lost the lift, went into a horrible spin that many people would not be able to get out of. But just short of the ground, she managed to use her stunt pilot training to get out of this mess. The Spitfire was demolished, but she survived.
Amazing stuff. We're having a question about people just double checking about who they're flying for, because they're American women, and you can see in the photo they're USA on the shoulder titles there and RAF wings. So they're who are they actually flying for? They're American nationals flying for the effectively under British command.
Yes, they were part of the Air Transport Auxiliary, which was affiliated with the Royal Air Force. So their job was to transport all the aircraft for the Royal Air Force. They did not work for the American Air Force when it came over to Britain. They were there first before the other Americans arrived, and they flew throughout for the Air Transport Auxiliary of the RAF.
And then, but there was a kind of not an exchange, but some of these figures did then move around because they were when the WASPs get set up later on. There is as you said earlier, some of these women didn't continue with this branch. They moved on and evolved because it was working, wasn't it? It was working. So everybody kind of sees this as being, you know what, we need to do more of this. We need to get more women involved in these sorts of jobs that are freeing men for the actual war stuff. So it goes back to this idea of them being pioneering. It was successful from the absolute outset, wasn't it?
Yes. And a few of them did go back to join the WASP when it was started in the United States, but most of them rejected that idea. They felt like they were at the center of the action there in Great Britain, and they didn't want to be off in Texas somewhere. And they made the right choice because there was a lot of resistance in the United States to the WASP, to women flyers, and it was actually disbanded in 1944 while the war was still raging, and those women lost those jobs. The ones who stayed in Great Britain were able to keep flying to the end.
And it's that interesting aspect of the fact that we talk about the special relationship between the USA and the UK, but you need people to kind of reinforce that at kind of roots level. And of course, Churchill and Roosevelt got on well at that level, but these women going over to the UK were helping the British understand that the Americans aren't so different for us, and we're all in this together. Because the Brits had come out a bit suspicious about the Americans at the beginning because of the reluctance for the USA to get into the war right at the beginning there. So these women, as we said, they're pioneering in terms of aviation, but they're also paving the way for just the millions of Americans that would eventually end up in the UK as World War II goes on. So they're doing a lot of kind of PR work as well, aren't they, in a roundabout way for just the USA and what the USA can provide, and that sense of we're with you.
Jackie Cochran had as one of her criteria that she wanted people who could be good ambassadors for the American pilots, and that was important to her. So she eliminated people who didn't have the personalities she thought would work.
Yeah, we had the question number. We can do this later on, but Jim Ross is asking, did any of the women go on to be test pilots? Because they aren't just, I mean, we could spend hours talking about where these women went to after the war and all the incredible career choices they do, but they're not just ferrying stuff, because they've got this experience of doing multiple aircraft, and that they are adding information. So give us an example of the kind of assistance they're giving to the development of flying in a broad sense.
Well, after the war, it was hard for them because in the United States, there was still a lot of resistance to women doing this kind of job. The military was still closed to them. The passenger airlines did not hire a woman pilot until 1973. There weren't a lot of jobs for them, so they had to get really creative about what they would do. None of them became a test pilot. Obviously, that would have been a great idea. They could fly anything, right? One of them, with a husband, set up a company that was a lot like the Air Transport Auxiliary. They transported privately aircraft around the world. They were often really dodgy aircraft in dicey situations. It was another really dangerous job, but that was what was available to her. And others did other things. I don't know if you want to go into it or not.
Well, we could be up to you, whatever you want to talk about. We're here to chat. But I mean, just going back to this idea of the fact of their experience, when they're meeting in messes and in those social environments, you could have pilots in the Royal Air Force who only ever flew one type of aircraft for the 4 or 5 years of the war, maybe a couple of later on. But these women, as we said, so many different types of aircraft in so many situations. So even if not officially, you have to think that they're chatting about, you should think about pulling the throttle back on a so-and-so. That they must have had an influence, but then pinning that down would be difficult. But they had to be knowledgeable, and that must have been being shared. I can't believe it wouldn't be. Flyers are flyers. They would like talking, wouldn't they?
Oh, yeah, of course they talked when they were there, but when they went back home, they were split up all over the country. They didn't have like a little club with each other anywhere. And so they took what they could get. One of the pilots, Nancy Miller, took a job at a flying school where she had to clean the bathrooms. But in her free time, she got certified to become a helicopter pilot and then a commercial helicopter pilot, only the second one in the United States, only the fourth woman in the world. And she wound up founding the first helicopter charter company in Alaska, which was very successful, a huge fleet of helicopters. And she flew helicopters in those cold conditions, another really dangerous job. They took the aviation jobs they could get around the edges and had to be entrepreneurial about that in order to keep flying.
I mean, thank you for that. We had the question about Trevor again asked, possibly a silly question, but what were the reasons given as to why they could not do combat flying, especially given that the Soviet Air Force had some female aircraft? I mean, was it a question of them, they were just happy to be doing something, and if they pushed it too far, they might have thought the barriers would come down? Or was there a point where people like Jackie were thinking, you know what, maybe we can try and get these women into combat?
Jackie was a very controversial character and contradictory character. She herself thought it was unnatural for women to fly in combat. So she was their strongest ally, and she was not pushing for that. So there was nobody in a position of power who was saying, yes, let's put women in bombers and send them over Berlin. It just wasn't happening. And these individual pilots were in no position to apply for the job because there was no such job.
I mean, they kind of maybe not knew their place, but grateful to be there at all, and don't push for too much. And the photo you sent me, this is one of my favorite, because it just, when we're talking about the different aircraft they're flying, that they are doing everything from Spitfires up to the big 4-engine bombers, and Joan Hughes there. I just can't imagine going from a Sterling on a Monday to a Spitfire on a Tuesday to a C-47 on a Wednesday and leaping in and out of these aircraft with the confidence they did. I mean, I'm running out of superlatives to describe just how brilliant these women were. And do you get a sense of in the reading the diaries that they ever felt that it was a bit overwhelming, or were they all such confident people? They just went, yeah, it's fine. It's another aircraft. It's another day. I mean, did you ever sense any kind of, they felt they were being swept along too fast by all these changes of aircraft?
In their diaries, never in public, they would say they were frightened. they were confused, and sometimes they would think, can I do this? In public, they kept a strong face on it. There's a wonderful quote from Joan Hughes. She was a British woman pilot, and she was questioned about how she could fly such a large aircraft. And she said, the job is for the plane to lift me, not for me to lift the plane.
Mm.
You didn't need that much physical strength, although a few of them, some of the women said it was hard, but they were strong enough to do it, so they did it. I think at the beginning, the Americans especially were frightened. They would get lost in the landscape. It was not familiar to them. And all the changes with the different kinds of planes was intimidating, yet they were really looking forward to each advancement to new planes because they wanted that in their logbooks. They were very competitive about who would be the first to fly a Spitfire, who would be the first to fly a Wellington bomber. So it was a mix. It was complex emotions. It was scary, and they were determined not to be scared. Many people said that the one requirement for a successful transport pilot was absolutely steady nerves. When you were in a crisis, you'd stay calm, you'd figure out your options, you'd decide what to do, you'd do it, you wouldn't let it get to you.
Yeah, and I mean, as you said earlier, that despite the fact there wasn't really this resistance to women flying, but at the same time, if there had been a slip up, if one of these women pilot had a, you know, I don't know, a mental breakdown, or who had crashed an aircraft into a control tower or something, you could imagine that the press would have jumped on that, and the stuffy old idiots would have gone, oh, this is we knew this was going to happen with women flying. So they're under a bit of pressure to just make sure that they keep going there. So I'm not surprised that their diaries reveal that they were a little bit, you know, apprehensive about doing all this stuff. But again, we said back to the beginning, this maintaining this composed, in control determination that had got them so far, you know, kind of the duck, you know, the serene on the top and paddling like fuck under the water kind of thing. That you can sense that among these pilots, in that they were being watched. There would have been people watching them, wanting them to fail. You see that with the 6888 and the Tuskegees and things. That anything that's a little bit new, there would be some people kind of just waiting in the wings, again, pun intended, for something to go wrong. So they are under pressure. They are being observed. The world is watching, which adds a whole other dimension to the fact that, as you said, they're also ferrying aircraft that are being delivered. They may be malfunctioning, or it's one that's been in a crash. So they're pressure all around.
Yes, and they all had accidents, and some were killed, of course, but so did the men. And after enough time passed, it became clear that the women's record was at least as good as the men's. Percentage-wise, fewer women were killed. I don't like to cite that because there could be a lot of factors at work there. Yeah. Men started earlier when things were even more dicey. So they were at least equal, and that was clear to everyone. Each time they would have an accident, they'd be called before this accident committee that was quite fearsome and would be very tough on them, deciding if it was the pilot to blame or the aircraft. No one like that. If you had too many of those strikes against you, you would be kicked out.
And I guess all they would want would be treated equally. You know, I mean, yes, of course, there have to be inquiries into accidents and things that go wrong, but as long as they're treated at the same basic level of, well, as you say there, let's look at whether it's aircraft failure or pilot error, but not be treated differently. As long as they're going into it on that equal footing, which clearly, as we said earlier, it was successful from the beginning. So there was this respect around there. So, but we got, I think I keep saying this is my favorite photo, but this is another one of my favorite photos you sent. I mean, it's got that whole, you can see the Amelia Earhart in that. You can see these pioneers. You can see in her face there that she's got a legacy of responsibility for the women that flew before her and the women that flew after. So talk about Mary.
Yes, this is Mary Zerbel. She was the youngest woman flying instructor in the United States at the age of 19, and she was often photographed because, as you see, she is very pretty. She considered being an actress and studied with Veronica Lake for a while. She had a very dramatic life over in the war. I think you see some of that in her face. She and her fiance were the first American service people to marry in the war zone. And they tried to do it in a quiet country church, but the press got wind of it and it was headlines all over the world. He was a bomber pilot. As you know, terrible survival rate. So she went through a lot of tragic circumstances throughout the war and kept flying through it. After the war, there was a movie made based on her life starring Lana Turner. It was called Lady Takes a Flyer. And it was very cheesy, Mary thought. She said they had her walking out of a flaming crash without a speck of dust on her. But she was quite well known, obviously, at the time. And what's sad is that over the years, her story was forgotten, even though she was quite the celebrity during the war.
Well, that's one of the things when we've talked about with similar subjects, like, for example, the Women's Land Army that in Britain after the First World War got broken up and then it got founded again in World War II. But, again, some of these, they were quickly shut down. I mean, the WASPs in the USA, they didn't even see it to VE Day. They've already gone. But these formations, these women, some of them were still flying right into the end of 1945, even after the war was over. So they ended up, though those that joined this, who said they had to go and join the RAF, the Americans going overseas, but in a sense, they got their reward because it did carry on for a while. Although, as you say, after that, the doors closed them pretty quickly once the war is absolutely firmly in the past. But they did have a good old long run, some of these. So who were the women that had the longest careers that you wrote about?
Well,
in terms of the war service.
Yes, Ann Wood started in the spring of 1942, and she was there until November of 1945. She managed to keep flying because after VE Day, they still had to get aircraft around to different places. She would sometimes fly aircraft up to beaches in Scotland where they would be sort of just put out to pasture. It was sort of symbolic to her how she was feeling about what would happen to her at the same time. She, after the war, ultimately did succeed and became the first woman vice president of an American airline, Pan Am. So those leadership qualities lasted through till after the war. I think she probably could have been the president had she been a man, but I think she probably ran a lot of Pan Am at that time.
The downside of long service, whether you're in the Navy, whether it is that eventually the strains and pressures can be too much. I mean, studies have been done about, combat soldiers after about 90 days, doesn't matter how brave you are, how fantastic you are, you just need a break. And as you said, some of these women are flying for months, years. Did you see in the diaries, in the paperwork, any sense of the fact that they carried on too far and maybe some of them should have found a way out? Are they pushing themselves too much? Are they showing the signs of strain and just longevity, just doing the same stuff? And I say that I can't imagine the responsibility of getting into an aircraft and getting it off the ground day after day and delivering it to the right place. And as you say, there were accidents. Did any of the diaries kind of reveal some darker aspects?
Well, I think there was more apprehension at the beginning when it was all new to them and they didn't know how it would play out. The ones who made it the whole way through to the end, they were pretty tough by then. They all got 2 days off every 2 weeks, and they would go into London and they would party hard. And some of them had a leave where they could go back to the United States for a month during the course of the war. But other than that, they kept up this pace, which is very impressive. But I really didn't see a lot of signs of them cracking. Now, some left earlier for various reasons. They may have thought, I've had it. And some were injured and were terminated because they weren't able to fly anymore. And not everyone survived. Those who made it to the end were these pretty tough people like Nancy Miller, who went on to do the helicopter company, and who ended up in the aviation industry. And Dorothy Fury was still there, but she didn't fly after the war. She went through her marriages instead.
Marriages, yeah, quite a life, yeah.
Very high-profile affairs as well. but yeah, people have asked me this. Didn't they have post-traumatic stress disorder? It's so stressful. Those who made it through to the end did not, and I don't know why. They were all.
It's obviously just testament to the fact that they had the right stuff was the film with Ed Harris, wasn't it, about the space program? They obviously from the very beginning they had all the qualities that were necessary, and it just saw the majority of them through. They were just better than us in some ways. They were better human beings. They were very good at what they did. So I want to talk to you more because we've just come out in of the VE Day commemorations in Europe and France, where I live, in the UK, and we're going to have VJ Day in August. And as I said earlier on, we are in an era where we're appreciating more the contribution of women generally in World War II, but there's still a little bit of a but only in their lane. As someone who writes about pioneering strong women, and I guess it'd be fair to say you're a strong and pioneering woman as well. Where do you think we are? Where do you think we are in the historiography of women in World War II broadly? I mean, is there still a stuffiness about certain men saying, well, no, we don't, women weren't doing very much? Where do you think we are?
I think it depends on who you're talking to. There are some people who are very interested in these pioneering women and want to know these stories, and a lot of people just aren't aware of them. And so those people are assuming that women weren't doing much. That's why I thought it was important to do this book. It's still controversial with some people. They think, oh, a woman pilot, what a bad idea. If they understood that women were doing this very difficult job that long ago, I think that would be helpful for women today. And I think it's also helpful for any young person today who wants to get into any kind of field where they think, I'm not considered the kind of person who can do this. If you hear about these stories and see that these were not people expected to do it, and yet they did it, I think it's inspiring to people even now who feel excluded from what they'd really like to do in life.
Absolutely, very, very good answer there, and the fact that we come back to the idea they were pioneering, they were doing something that was sort of considered outside of what their sex should be doing. And when you make, this is World War II TV, it's a very knowledgeable war-based audience, so they kind of broadly understand about the SOE and the women and the WASPs and things like that. But if you're talking to maybe a book club type audience or a general, are there misconceptions the average American, for example, has about these group of women? Are there things that they will ask you and you go, no, that's not it? I mean, they must all be lesbians or something like that. Is there anything that do you get any kind of cliched assumptions people make?
I haven't heard that, but maybe book clubs aren't the kinds of people who would say that.
I mean, I do like bad research. I found a website that said it was like famous dykes in history or something, and it said, oh, the pilots must all have been. And I'm thinking, I'd like to see your evidence for that. But I wonder whether there are certain assumptions, because sometimes men can be very fearful of strong women. So I wonder whether there's kind of attempt to rewrite it. And as you said, Jackie Cochran was a bit. She was an interesting individual, controversial in some ways, pioneering in others. But are there any kind of misassumption that people make?
Well, I think a common misassumption is that people assume that after the war they got to keep being pilots, and they didn't. People are a little surprised at that. They're so qualified. Why did that not happen? Because if you're in today's world, you don't realize just how hard it was back then. It's one of the things I like about this story, that these remind me of women today, and that a lot of the issues are the same. They were all facing, how do I get ahead in a career where I'm not that welcome?
Yeah.
How do I balance? Do I want to get married and have children? How will that affect my career? Do I not want to get married? All these women made very different choices along those lines during the war and after. They were a little less enamored of a traditional life, getting married and running a household. Most of them wanted to do something else in addition. So they do remind me of people today, and I can relate to them a lot myself.
Yeah, I know that makes sense. And we must remind ourselves that they pushed open these doors, but then, as you said, after all, some of these doors were closed back again, and they were back out to where they started. It was a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of career thing. And that is the tragedy in some ways, is that they weren't recognized and pushed on. And I mean, you talked about some of those that did manage to kind of carry on, but yeah, there was a little bit of kind of, yeah, well, okay, thanks for the war, but yeah, back to where you started, and that's a crying shame. And when the family members of people that you wrote about there, did they must be proud of their grandmothers, their great aunts, things like that, and what they did there. But did you find that they completely understood what their grandmothers had done? Were they learning as well? Because I sense there was, in what you've been reading between the lines again, that some of them, when they did find that they did get married, for example, or they did realize that they couldn't carry on in flying, there might have been a bit of bitterness, and so they stopped talking about it, and they just kind of put that part in the past. But so did you find that family members were surprised by what their grandmothers got up to?
It's been so fun dealing with the family members, because they didn't necessarily hear a whole lot about their mothers and aunts' exploits after the war. Like a lot of people who served in World War II,
Yeah.
they didn't talk about it a whole lot. The world had moved on and they were doing other things. Virtually every family member I managed to track down had always been surprised that their relatives weren't more celebrated for what they did. Now, in the UK, these transport pilots were quite celebrated and have been after the war, and many of them had books. There were documentaries made about them. But in the United States, they were completely forgotten. I think they were just outside the normal paths of history. They weren't serving for a United States military. People who were researching the war just never came across them. So the families are very excited now that this is becoming public. And many of them went up into their attics for me and found these old diaries and letters. Thank God they saved them. They're so informative. They always saved them, thinking there should be a reason for this. The pilots themselves had a reunion in 1979, and they talked about how they'd never thought of themselves as being involved in women's liberation, as they called it. But one of them did say, but we were the thin edge of the wedge.
That's a great way of putting it. And I mean, going back to what you said about this being an American women with the Brits, because as I said, my grandmother was a housewife before the war and then got a little job in the women's voluntary service in World War II. So I think if you're a British person from that era, would just accepted and understood that women were mobilized because they were everywhere. As I said earlier, they were driving the buses, they were driving the trains, they were making ammunition, they were doing everything. So it, of course, although there wasn't actually a dedicated memorial to the women in World War II in London until relatively a few years ago, it took like 7 decades there. But I think there was this general acceptance. And I think maybe the USA, because of its distance in some ways from the war, apart from Pearl Harbor excluded and German submarines on the coast, their life in Chicago kind of carried on a bit the same as it had done before the war, whereas London, the war was right there in your face. So that distance, maybe that perhaps the USA just didn't quite realize what these women had done, because it wasn't so obvious. It wasn't in their faces all the time.
Yes, and when the pilots went home on their leave, they were almost offended that life was going on in such a normal way, because they saw in the UK that everyone was affected. Everyone was subject to the rationing, the deprivation, and the fear of being hit with a V2 rocket. In the United States, they felt people seemed complacent. There was rationing in the United States, but it was nothing compared to what was happening overseas. So they felt that difference very strongly, and they thought, people will have a different attitude after the war about this because of it.
Absolutely. So to kind of wrap things up, but you kind of talked a little bit about what you hope that they will get this recognition that they deserve and things. But do you think you've got the bug now for more World War II stuff? Do you think you'll return to the war? Have you got any other ideas? Because I've spoken to so many historians on this channel who dabbled in World War II, and then it kind of took over their life a bit. So do you feel this is the beginning of more work in this field, or will you bounce off to something else again?
It could be. I mean, I've really enjoyed it, and there's a lot of drama in that war. when you write nonfiction, as all of your guests do, you don't get to make up stories and make up the most dramatic characters and circumstances. I felt that I was handed a gift with this story. These characters are fantastic. If you made them up, people would think, no, that's too much. There was so much drama. It's going to be hard to find another subject that works so beautifully as a story and while remaining completely true. So I'm looking into some things and thinking about it, but it won't be easy.
No, I mean, just looking at the the publicity materials around your book. I mean, the thumbnail sketches of some of these women. I mean, as you say, they sound like the kind of characters you'd base entire movie genres about. Everyone that has this, wow, that if you, as you said, you couldn't make that person up. These incredibly strong, but diverse. They're from different backgrounds and different aspirations, but with this unique thing of a love of flying. I think that's what it comes down to. If there's anything that got them through this war, and you say there they didn't seem to, from your research, kind of suffer from too much of the, the combat fatigue. It was just maybe that pure love of being in the air and just being out there and doing something pioneering was the thing that kept them going.
I think it was. And for all of them later, they all said that this was the highlight of their lives. They had such an adventure. They embraced the freedom they had, the respect that they won, the challenge, the danger. They even liked the danger. It gave them some adrenaline. They loved everything about it. And while there were many tragic things that happened as well, I feel like their story feels buoyant because they were having the time of their lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That comes across in reading your book and what these women did. They did. It was an important time of their life. As I said, there is tragedy. Some of their friends were killed, and they didn't quite get some of the things after all they were hoping for. But yeah, at the same time, they could all go back home and job done. They did their bit for their, not just for their country, but for the Allies and for the UK. And so they should be proud of themselves, and there's none left now. But you should be proud of bringing their story to us. So, Becky, it's been fantastic talking to you. So, I wish you great success with the book. I know it's already doing very well. So, fantastic. So, as I said earlier, folks, there are links to the description to buy it, or you can buy it at your favorite bookstore. But with that, I will leave it there, folks. I'm back again talking about the LSTs operationally with Andrew Zimmerman. That was an earlier time, 2 hours earlier, and then back on Monday with loads more stuff. So there we go. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, viewers. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Friday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers.